Each year at this time, we look to answer your questions on At Issue. We did it this year too, but with a twist. We did it on Facebook Live a few nights ago and got some great ones. So we wanted you to see some of the highlights. Remember, this is not live, but we think you'll enjoy it nevertheless. You'll love these, Andrew. There's a couple of questions about the electoral reform. Paris Marx asks, why is it so hard to adopt a proportional voting system in Canada when so many European countries have had PR for so long?
I think it's the tyranny of the status quo. It's the only system most of us have known. We've had systems similar to that at the provincial level in decades past, but for most of us who've been in our lifetime, it's the only system we've ever known. In fact, Canada, I think, is the only country where it's first past the post at every level of government. So when you've never had any experience of anything to the contrary, it's very easy for it to be painted as this dark and scary prospect. Oh, that'll be that system in some scary foreign place. And I don't think a lot of Canadians are aware that, in fact, most of the democratic countries on earth use some form of proportional representation. So that's common in a lot of debates in this country. We tend to get wrapped up in what's happening either in Canada, or we look down to the States and we compare ourselves to the States. We don't look sort of east-west a little bit and see, oh, there's a lot of different ways of running a democracy.
But it's also the Westminster Mother of Parliament model that is, if it's good enough for them, that is where our institutions come from. Are you saying that you want us to adopt the French way of electing people in office, etc., right? In our lifetimes, I'll remind you, the Constitution was in Westminster. Mm-hmm. So it's not as if we've done a lot of thinking outside the box that was created.
It'll be interesting if the Brits, this subject is boiling away in Britain right now, because they've had some of the same, I would argue, distortions from the system, and it's caused a lot of grief there. So if the Brits ever bring in proportional representation, that may knock the props out from under.
Then we're good to go.
Charlie Benchley asks the following question. Why do you think the Liberals waited until December, likely the busiest time of year for Canadians, to launch their problematic mydemocracy.ca survey?
That's a really good question. Yeah. This is the kind of survey that should have been done at the front end of the exercise during the 8 months where the file wasted away with nothing happening before a special committee was tasked with this. It is a cart that comes while the horse is already off and away, and it speaks to me of a lack of engagement on the part of the PMO and this file. It is a Justin Trudeau promise, but I think the energy was onto the climate pipeline file, and in a nonchalant way for something on which a clock is ticking. If you want this to be done, if you're serious for 2019, there is very little time left. Nothing much happened for months on end, and here we are with this, I think, fairly useless exercise.
Yeah, there may not be a nefarious intent. People are always quick to see conspiracies, etc. It may just be, I think if you're in the PMO, you're drinking from a fire hose every day. It's just so many different priorities. But what it does say is this was not necessarily the top of their priority list.
Did you fill it out?
The My Democracy, yeah.
But did you send it?
I filled it out several times, in fact.
Kept doing it until you got it right, or?
Exactly. I was. I think the first time. I think when I was more honest than some of my other answers. I think I was an innovator.
But it's a bit like the what you see in women's magazines when you're waiting to get your haircut, and, how to be the perfect this and that. You read the questions, you kind of know what you should answer to get what you want. And I tried it, but I didn't send it to see where it led, and I'm not sure what the value of something that people will answer if they're engaged is for the government.
Yeah, it's not a scientific survey. No. A lot of the questions were either false choices or skewed one way or the other. A lot of the questions they might have asked, they didn't ask, not only about electoral reform, but about the existing system. A lot of the questions were designed to kind of alert people to potential downfalls of a new system. Nobody was asked about, well, what about some of the downfalls of the existing system?
Right. Those are not the kind of magazines in the men's haircutting
Obviously. But they are fun to read. So you're missing out.
Yeah, obviously, we are. Before I get into a couple of questions here, do you use the term alt-right?
Yeah, I suppose. I'm aware that it's people say you should just say racist, white supremacist, et cetera.
Right. And so why don't you?
Well, sometimes I do. I just, you
I
slip
do.
into it once.
I say it because it was a white supremacist that coined the alt-right phrase.
Yeah.
Right? The guy who had that rally a few weeks ago and did the Heil Trump stuff.
I don't use it because it means nothing to a francophone, and I figure it possibly means nothing to most of my readers because it doesn't resonate with me in a second language. So I have not been using it, and at first
So
I
what do
wasn't
you use?
racist,
Okay.
but alt-right. I mean, I'm not sure about English-speaking readers, but for sure there's no equivalent that I mean, we use extreme droite, but it doesn't capture the reality of it.
Okay. Well, here's some questions on this. Evan James asks, do you think that there is a risk, he uses alt-right populist movement, we'll say white supremacist, racist populist movement in Canada in the coming months or years as we see provincial and federal elections?
Well, and there's where maybe the alt-right term has some utility is there's a spectrum from the white supremacists to just populists. And some of the populists might call themselves alt-right, I don't know. So that's why you want to be a little bit careful of the term, and some of these things are a bit fluid. Is there a populist right in Canada? Yes, there is. How big is it? We don't know. That's one of the things I think is going to be tested in this Conservative leadership race. Certainly Kelly Leitch and a couple of the other candidates have pitched themselves pretty hard at that kind of Donald Trump style of vote. You could say to some extent the Harper government kind of dabbled in that, put their toe in the water of that kind of thing, maybe more than their toe, but certainly didn't go as far as Trump has. That's, so having lost the election, and in some cases people saying a big chunk of that was people being uneasy and fed up with that type of approach to politics,
right.
That's going to be a big debate within the Conservative Party.
But I'm not sure that populist rhymes with right-wing or racist in any way, shape, or form. Bernie Sanders was described as a populist, and I would not say that he has as racist undertones. The LEAP manifesto is the product of an attempt at populism on the left. So it's going to be very hard to capture those terms, but I take issue with the notion that anything that is called populist has negative undertones.
It depends, I agree, and nationalism same way. So populists these days tend to be nationalists, so they're concerned about immigration, for example. Now, if you're Bernie Sanders, maybe that's more to do with wages at the bottom, protecting them from competition, et cetera. But for some other people, it's, well, this is changing the culture of the country, and I'm not so keen about that. And not everybody who feels that way is a racist by any means, but certainly some of them are. And so that's why these terms have some of this sort of baffling fluidity to them, and you have to be very careful how you're applying these terms to whom and what circumstances.
All right, here's the other question on it. Craig Maxwell asks, what do you think the Liberals will need to do to strategize against the push of that group in the coming years? The Democrats underestimated it and lost the White House as a result.
As I say, I think the first test is going to be for the Conservatives, or the non-populist Conservatives, as to how to grapple with that. And we'll see, depending on how strong it proves to be within that party, how much the Liberals have to deal with it. I think there's reasons to think, and I know this can be a hostage to fortune, that this can be proven wrong, but there's reason to think that we're in a different situation in Canada than these other countries. We have not had the same crises of immigration, particularly in Europe, but also arguably in the United States, that they have for various reasons. We have not gone through the same financial crises to anything like the same extent. There hasn't been the same discrediting, therefore, of the whole sort of expert and elite groups within this country. So we're, I think, generally speaking, in a better frame of mind as a country, and that you would think, therefore, there'd be less of a market for this kind of very angry, often grievance-based politics. But I stand to be proven wrong.
As you said, it did kind of pop up a little bit in the last year of the Harper government and was rejected.
It was also rejected in Quebec with the Quebec Charter, with a minister that I would cite, Bernard Dainville, a former colleague of yours, who is a lot closer to populism and a lot more adept at it than anything I've seen so far on the other side, on the Canadian front. And despite that, I mean, if anyone was going to connect these issues with people, he stood to be that person. And at the end of the day, where is he today? He's a media commentator. He couldn't win.
What worse fate could there be?
No, but the thing is, he couldn't run for the leadership afterwards because he was toxic. And even when there was not a star running for the leadership, he just left politics. So that kind of tells me something. If you can't sell it in an audience that is as tightly knit as Francophone Quebecers can be, it may be a hard sell across Canada.
There's a tangle of issues there that are connected, and that it depends which nerve ending you press with people, in Quebec and in the rest of Canada as well, around identity, around nationalism, around security. I would argue that Dalton McGuinty, basically in 2007, ran a anti-Muslim scare campaign. It was beautifully done. It was all phrased as an appeal to universal tolerance, but it was playing on a lot of people's fears about Muslim schools are going to turn into terrorist factories, etc. I don't think it was a particularly, graceful moment in Canadian politics. The PQ tried to do something similar in Quebec, and it was working for them a while, and then they overdid it, and it didn't work as well for them. Stephen Harper was getting some results by pressing on that nerve ending, and then did it the wrong way, and people recoiled.
It's astounding that the two parties who endorsed the kneecap ban in Quebec, which had apparently support in the polls, are parties, the Conservatives and the Bloc, who actually finished third and fourth and lost a share of the vote over it.
We've had a lot of questions about Kevin O'Leary, who's not in the Conservative leadership race, but is around the edges and, getting lots of, he's getting some press attention, not from everybody, but he's getting a fair amount of it for somebody who's not in the race. Why isn't he in the race? He says he's not in the race until there are fewer candidates. There are 14 at the moment. He wants to see the race cull down. Others believe the real reason he's not in the race is he doesn't want to do the French language debate, which comes up next. It's in
Well, he's not going to
January.
be able to hide the fact that he can't speak French, and he has managed to make a lot of people offended by his notion that young Quebecers who don't tend to vote Conservative, just so he knows, are bilingual, so they don't care. I've sat next to young colleagues who were up in arms over this and found this so totally unacceptable as a position. You look at every poll about bilingual leaders, and I've seen those polls about Pauline Marois and Stéphane Dion, whose English was very much work in progress, and 98% would say this is not bilingual enough. So
can you win the Conservative leadership race with no support from French Quebec?
It's very hard because every riding is worth the same amount of points, and unless you sweep the rest of Canada, you're not going to win by just first choices. You're going to need second choices. There are 78 ridings. It's the second largest pool of points. And it's not just Francophone Quebec. People in Montreal, on the West Island, are not going to vote for a Conservative leader who can't speak French in Quebec.
It's not just Quebec.
No.
Right? If you want to win Ontario, one of the things Ontarians ask is, are you credible in Quebec?
New Brunswick?
And New Brunswick as well.
I mean, they rejected Preston Manning, who was the founder of the Reform Party, for Stockwell Day, in part because Stockwell Day could speak French. And Kevin O'Leary has many qualities, possibly, but he is no Preston Manning.
He's a very odd candidate, if you want to get into Kevin O'Leary more generally. Is
anything odd anymore after what we've
well,
witnessed?
exactly, and we'll see whether there's a market for it or not. I mean, most of his pronouncements until now, most of them, there's a line that's said about Donald Trump is that he's not so much a conservative, he's a lefty student's idea of a conservative. Like, he conforms to every stereotype and crude caricature that people might imagine about conservatives. And a lot of O'Leary's statements on the economy over the years have kind of fit that mold. They're so simplistic and so reductionist that they just make free marketers cringe. But then he says things like, the CBC is my favorite news organization in the world.
Yeah, there is something to say about O'Leary.
Which
Believe me, I fell over the table reading that at breakfast the other day.
Leaving aside the rights and wrongs of it, not the sort of thing you would generally say when you were campaigning for the leadership of the Conservative
How
Party.
about soldiers?
And then saying that there's no honor in being a warrior.
Yes.
So you sort of wonder sometimes, and he said
But
that
that's
one time that he might
exactly-
run for another leadership, but part of leadership of
Isn't
another
that
party.
exactly what Trump did? So the outrageous, unexpected, wouldn't be the Republican position.
But Trump played to factions within the Republican Party. He energized them. This is the opposite. If you were going to do the CBC or the Warrior thing, you probably should run for the NDP.
And just to come back to the rules of the race,
That'd be something to see. I'm running for the NDP.
just to come back to the rules of the race, Trump was running against 16 other candidates. A lot of those states were winner take all. Okay, so all the field was divided against him. In this race, not only are each of the ridings equally weighted, but the votes are allotted proportionally. It's not winner take all. You don't just take that riding and get all of its votes. And it's a ranked ballot. So a candidate like a Kevin O'Leary or a Kelly Leach, somebody who really has a polarizing impact, is going to have a much tougher, I'm not saying it can't be done, but it has a much tougher road to get to the victory in this race.
Andy Phillips asks this question: can the Bloc Québécois ever make a comeback?
I don't think so. I'm watching their absent leadership. There has not been a permanent Bloc Québécois leader in the House of Commons since 2011. In the last election, they gave coming back their best shot with Gilles Duceppe, who could not even win a seat. They actually won more seats, but on splits. They lost votes. Now they have a former PQ minister who is musing about running for the leadership and sitting in the National Assembly as Bloc Québécois leader because they can't afford to pay her and there is no safe seat for her. I'm not sure that many Quebecers will find that a very serious proposition.
If you look at the arc of Bloc support, and you could say the same thing looking at the longer frame of PQ support, there's a kind of a long-term secular downtrend that gets interrupted or has been interrupted in years past by periodic crises. Without some kind of animating crisis, it does seem hard, and now you can't rule out that ever happening.
But it takes a real, I mean, suppose, for instance, that we had a pipeline crisis, which I believe would allow some parties to reform coalitions on different terms. The NDP is there.
Yeah.
It's got MPs that are now live. It's not just a legend from outside Quebec. So that vote would probably go in large part to the NDP if they can find a leader that can keep them going.
But he is saying, and this is, kind of the natural question that we followed over the last 50 years, is saying that the Bloc can't make a comeback. That's not the same as saying separatism is dead.
The Bloc was part of a strategy that was certainly worthwhile for the sovereignty movement in 1995. But if the vote had not been so close, the Bloc probably would have folded before. They became hostage to what they saw as a near win, and slowly but surely the numbers proved that no was no. But the Bloc itself, if you could take it out of the mix and still, if sovereignty was to have a revival, imagine it happening. At this point, though, the real problem is that the younger Quebecers are not into that.
It's funny because there's sometimes you try to explain to the younger people who are coming into the business that it was only 20 years ago that the official opposition in Canada was the Bloc Québécois, and they look at you, come on, it's not possible. Yeah. And it was possible, and it was the case. Moving on. Katie McGregor asked this. It's a kind of a general question about journalism, but especially right now, it is a powerful question that we're all going through ourselves thinking about as a result of a lot of things we've seen over the last few years, and especially this past year. How will the media, journalists in general, win back the trust of the people?
Short answer is nobody knows. Second answer would be, I'm not sure we've lost the trust of the people. There is a section of the public that doesn't trust us, and there's a section within that thinks we're the cause of all their problems. There's a broader section of the public that it's not so much that they don't trust us, it's just they don't have sufficient need for us to be willing to plunk down their money for us. I think that's a really existential dilemma.
But the trust in journalists and the media in general has definitely slipped over the last years, to the point where, when they're asked, when various professions are ranked, we're pretty far down there. Politicians are lower than us, but it's still pretty low.
Yeah, but it's normal for messengers, who often are messengers of things you don't want to hear, to be dismissed rather than have to take into account what they're telling you. I don't find that particularly troubling. I have to say I found it more troubling that a news anchor in America could command public opinion from the desk of reading news than the opposite. I'm happy enough that people are skeptical about the media because it means they're less likely to be manipulated by news coverage, and I think it forces everyone to up their game. So I'm not
Absolutely. I mean, skepticism is a positive quality. Blind nihilistic rejection of everything is not. That's not skepticism. That's just an absolutism of another kind. So I agree that it's good to be in a world where things are more contested than they might have been in the past. I'm much more concerned, however, where that contested quality of debate, which is a positive thing, has degraded into just an inability even to have positive discussions because nobody has the same set of facts. We're all picking and choosing, and people are denying that facts matter. And this kind of extreme degradation of the discourse, I think, is very troubling.
But if you're also going to be talking about journalists, I think it would be wise on the part of news organizations and journalists who have, so much more exposure. Look at us here than in the old days, to talk about things to which they bring actual facts and knowledge, and not just about any issue. I've listened to panels when I'm driving on Radio-Canada, to name one place, where two people just sit every day of the week and they will discuss any issue that happens to be in the news that day, except that they know nothing about Syria.
Yeah.
And that demeans the bringing of information, this notion that because you're a journalist, you can comment on anything and never bring any knowledge to what you're talking about.
But what I think is even worse, though, and more malignant, is dismissing the people who do know something about a subject as well. They're just experts. What the hell would we want elites and experts? Right? I saw somebody on the TV the other day saying, it's true that pilots sometimes crash planes. That doesn't mean we're going to go and get a men's room attendant to fly a plane. We still want to get trained pilots to fly the plane. With all due respect to the men's room attendants around the world.
And those were the highlights of your questions for At Issue on Facebook. A reminder, we've got our annual At Issue versus the Insiders quiz show coming up this Thursday night. You won't want to miss that one.